In the spring of 1840, the Alabama sun cast its golden rays across miles of cotton fields, the white blooms swaying like a restless ocean under the southern sky. At the center of this empire stood William Hargrove, a man whose name was both feared and respected across the county. He was not just a landowner, he was a symbol of wealth and authority in a world where land defined power and reputation defined legacy. William came from a long line of planters. His father had carved their family name into Alabama soil with sweat, cunning, and an unyielding hand over the enslaved men and women who worked their fields. When his father passed, William inherited more than just land. He inherited an empire and the responsibility to uphold the family's standing. For William, pride was not simply a personal trait, it was a currency. His reputation in town meetings, church gatherings, and trade dealings depended on the perception that he was a man of unshakable discipline and honor. Every handshake had to feel firm, every word had to carry authority, and every action had to reflect strength. To falter, even in the privacy of his own home, meant weakness. And weakness, in the world of Southern aristocracy, could spread like a crack through porcelain until the whole vessel shattered. His plantation house, a grand white, pillared mansion overlooking the fields, was his stage. Visitors often marveled at the scale of it. Sprawling porches, imported furniture, and chandeliers that reflected the glow of countless oil lamps. Yet beneath the surface grandeur lay a strict order. William demanded obedience not only from those he enslaved, but also from his household staff, his children, and most of all, his wife Eleanor. To him, the family name had to shine unmarred by scandal or weakness. William rose every day before dawn, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he inspected the fields. He would stand tall, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning rows of cotton, noting every detail. He saw himself not as a mere planter, but as a commander overseeing an army. Discipline was his creed, and discipline in his mind was what separated greatness from ruin. But pride is a double-edged sword. The same pride that built William's standing also made him fragile. Any insult, any whisper, any perceived disobedience could unravel the carefully woven image of control he had built. He could not tolerate mockery, nor could he endure betrayal. His sense of honor was so entwined with his identity that to strike one was to wound the other. In town, people spoke of William with respect, but also with caution. He was known to be fair in business but merciless when crossed. A rival merchant once tried to cheat him in a cotton deal, and by the next season, that man's reputation was ruined, blacklisted by every buyer William had connections with. Neighbors admired his success but feared his temper. He smiled at Sunday sermons, yet his eyes always carried the weight of a man who calculated every threat to his status. At home, his wife Eleanor often bore the brunt of his obsession with reputation. She was expected to act the part of the perfect Southern lady, graceful, loyal, silent in matters of decision. She had gowns from Charleston, pearls from New Orleans, and a place of honor beside William at every gathering. Yet beneath the surface, she lived in quiet suffocation. William's pride did not leave room for her needs, her voice, or her desires. For William, Eleanor was part of his estate, a symbol of refinement, not a partner of equal standing. Still, William believed he had built a fortress of control. His wealth was steady, his children were groomed to carry on the Hargrove name, and his wife, despite her quietness, kept up appearances in public. When he stood on the balcony of his mansion, overlooking the fields at sunset, he felt like a king surveying his kingdom. Every slave that bowed his head, every guest that praised his land, reinforced the image that William was untouchable. But pride, when unchecked, blinds men to the cracks beneath their feet. What William did not realize was that beneath the polished surface of his perfect world, silent storms were gathering. The enslaved whispered among themselves at night about their master's arrogance, waiting for the day justice might come. And Eleanor, beneath her silken gowns and pearls, carried a heart heavy with resentment and longing. Longing for affection, for freedom, for something beyond the gilded cage of respectability William had locked her in. The townsfolk often said, "A man's house is his castle," and William Hargrove believed it with every fiber of his being. But even castles fall when pride builds walls too high and ignores the unrest within. For now William stood tall, his reputation gleaming, his pride unbroken. But the very foundation of his empire was not the marble pillars or the cotton fields. It was trust, loyalty, and respect. And when those began to erode, no wealth or land could protect him from the collapse that awaited. In Alabama, 1840, William Hargrove was the proud plantation owner, admired, feared, and envied. Yet history has shown time and again that pride often walks hand in hand with downfall. And William's story was no different. Eleanor Hargrove had everything that most women of Alabama society in the 1840s were told they should desire. She lived in a sprawling mansion with white pillars that stretched like sentinels toward the sky. She wore gowns imported from Charleston, lace gloves stitched in France, and strings of pearls that glistened against her pale neck. At dinners and church gatherings, people praised her beauty, her poise, and her fortune to be married to William Hargrove, the most respected planter in the county. But what they did not see, what they could not hear beneath her graceful silence, was the emptiness that consumed her life. From the day she married William, Eleanor learned quickly that her role was not to love but to obey. William expected loyalty, grace, and silence. He provided her with luxury but not affection, with status but not warmth. He was a man of discipline, one who ruled his home the way he ruled his fields, firmly, coldly, without compromise. In his world, there was no room for tenderness, no space for the delicate needs of a woman who longed for companionship. Eleanor felt her loneliness grow with each passing year. The house was large but hollow, filled with echoes rather than laughter. William's words were more commands than conversations. At gatherings he paraded her like a trophy, but in private he left her alone in her chambers while he focused on ledgers, field reports, or whiskey by the fire. To the world she was the mistress of Hargrove Plantation, but to herself she was a prisoner in silk gowns. Loneliness has a way of softening resistance. In the still hours of the night, when the cicadas sang outside her window and the house fell into silence, Eleanor's thoughts wandered. She longed for a voice that spoke gently, a touch that lingered not out of possession but out of love. It was during one of William's frequent trips to Montgomery for business that Eleanor's quiet rebellion began. He was gone for nearly 2 weeks, and in his absence, the house seemed to breathe differently. Without his shadow stretching across every corner, Eleanor allowed herself small freedoms. She strolled the garden longer, laughed more easily with the maids, and even joined the church choir practices in town, something William considered beneath her dignity. At one of those choir rehearsals, she met him. His name was Thomas Whitfield, a younger man from town, not wealthy, not powerful, but charming in a way William never had been. Thomas was a schoolteacher's son, educated but modest, and his words carried warmth. He spoke to Eleanor not as an ornament, but as a woman asking her opinions, listening to her thoughts. Their conversations began innocently, exchanged during the breaks between hymns. But with every word, Eleanor felt life returning to her chest, as if a long-forgotten part of her had awoken. Their meetings grew more frequent, at first hidden beneath the excuse of church duties. But soon, the secrecy became deliberate. Eleanor would linger after rehearsals, her heart racing at the sight of Thomas's smile. She discovered what it felt like to be desired, not as a symbol of power, but as a woman of flesh and heart. The affair at its core was not merely about passion. It was about escape. For Eleanor, Thomas represented freedom, however fleeting. In his presence, she could shed the suffocating mask of perfection that William demanded. With Thomas, she laughed like a girl again, spoke freely, and dreamed of a world beyond the rigid walls of Hargrove Plantation. But in Alabama society, secrets did not stay hidden for long. Whispers began in town, carried by sharp-eyed neighbors and curious servants. A lingering glance here, a missed Sunday service there. Small details added fuel to gossip. Women at church began to murmur, disguising their suspicions as sympathy. "Poor Mrs. Hargrove," they would say, "so lonely in that grand house." But their eyes sparkled with curiosity, eager for scandal. Even the enslaved workers on the plantation began to notice changes. Eleanor's walks grew longer, her expression softer. She seemed distant, distracted, her eyes carrying a light that had not been there before. For years, she had treated them coldly, as William demanded, but now, Her face sometimes softened when she thought no one was watching. Though they could not know the details, they sensed something stirring in their mistress's world. Eleanor knew the danger. Adultery, especially for a woman in the South, was more than a personal betrayal. It was a public crime against her husband's honor. A man might be forgiven for straying, a woman almost never. Discovery meant ruin, yet the pull of freedom, the hunger for affection, was stronger than fear. In stolen moments with Thomas, she felt alive. The risk, though heavy, seemed worth the breath of life it gave her soul. Still, every secret has its cracks. One evening after choir, Eleanor lingered too long. Thomas walked her home under the moonlight, their steps lingering, their hands brushing against each other. A neighbor spotted them and raised an eyebrow. By morning, whispers reached the ears of men in town, who carried them like wildfire to William's business associates. Rumors, once born, cannot be silenced. They traveled faster than Eleanor could control, faster than William's carriage wheels could return from Montgomery. By the time he came back to the plantation, his name was already buzzing in hushed tones. Hargrove's wife has been seen walking with another man. William, the man of iron pride, had not yet heard the full truth. But he felt it in the way people looked at him differently, how their words paused before his name, his honor. The very thing he had built his life upon was now under threat. And for Eleanor, the fragile world she had built with Thomas was beginning to collapse. The affair, once her refuge, now loomed as a storm on the horizon. She had wanted love, she had wanted freedom, but what she had stirred would soon bring judgment, not only on her, but on everyone around her. This 1,000-word expansion paints Eleanor not as a villain, but as a tragic figure, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, reaching for life in the only way she knew, yet entangled in the dangerous web of 1840 Southern honor culture. William Hargrove returned from Montgomery earlier than expected. The business trip had ended in his favor, and he rode home with the satisfaction of a man who believed fortune always smiled upon him. But as his carriage rolled down the long oak-lined road toward the plantation, he noticed something unsettling. The enslaved field workers paused in their labor as he passed, not with the usual hurried bows and fearful eyes, but with glances exchanged among themselves, furtive, questioning. It was subtle, but William, sharp as ever, recognized it immediately. Something was amiss. By the time he reached the mansion, the whispers in town had already arrived before him. His overseer, a loyal man eager to curry favor, hesitated as he greeted William at the steps. "Good to have you back, sir," he said, his eyes flickering nervously. William narrowed his gaze. He was a man who could smell weakness, and now he smelled it in his own household. Inside, Eleanor greeted him with forced warmth. She kissed his cheek, her hands trembling as she smoothed her gown. William, though, was not a man easily fooled. His eyes studied her as though she were a ledger with numbers out of place. Something about her smile was different. Something about the air in the house felt unsettled. That evening, over dinner, William spoke little. He watched Eleanor instead, the way she avoided his eyes, the way she toyed with her food. He asked simple questions, about the children, the choir, the garden, and each time her answers came too quickly, too rehearsed. His suspicion deepened. For William, suspicion was not tolerable. It was an infection that needed cutting out before it spread. He began to question the servants quietly, one by one, using the same methodical intimidation he used in business deals. Most said nothing, loyal to Eleanor in silence. But eventually, a maid, young and nervous, let slip a detail. Mrs. Hargrove had been walking home from town on several evenings with Thomas Whitfield. The name struck William like a hammer. Thomas Whitfield. He knew the young man, the teacher's son, with barely 2 pennies to his name. The thought that his wife, his Eleanor, had allowed herself to be seen publicly with such a man was worse than betrayal. It was humiliation. William's pride, the very foundation of his being, cracked. Rage swelled inside him, hotter than the Alabama summer. To him, Eleanor had not merely broken her vows. She had dragged his name through the mud. She had turned whispers into weapons, giving his enemies a chance to laugh behind his back. For William, this was not simply about love or loyalty. It was about honor, and honor demanded vengeance. That night, William confronted Eleanor. He burst into her chambers, his face red with fury, his voice trembling with the force of barely contained violence. "Tell me the truth, woman," he thundered.
"Tell me what you've done."
Eleanor, startled from her reading, looked up with wide eyes.
"William, don't lie to me!"
he roared, slamming his fist against the dresser. "You think I don't know? You think the town doesn't whisper?" Thomas Whitfield. The sound of the name made Eleanor's blood run cold. Her lips parted, but no words came. She tried to summon excuses, but the look in William's eyes told her it was useless. He already knew. Her silence was answer enough. William's fury exploded. He seized a vase from the table and hurled it against the wall, shattering it into pieces. Eleanor flinched, clutching her gown. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, but William, despite his rage, was a man of control. Instead, he stepped back, his chest heaving, his mind racing with darker thoughts. "You have shamed me?" he growled, his voice low but venomous. "You have made a mockery of my name, my house, my bloodline, and you think you can walk free? No. No, Eleanor, you will not destroy me." Eleanor tried to speak, her voice shaking. "William, please, I never meant." But her husband cut her off with a glare so sharp it silenced her instantly. His decision was made. He would not keep this matter hidden. To do so would make him appear weak. No, this would be settled publicly. Eleanor would not simply be punished. She would be made into a warning. The next morning, William summoned the overseer and the enslaved workers to gather in the courtyard. The sun blazed down, hot and merciless, as Eleanor was dragged before them. Her once pristine appearance was disheveled, her hair loose, her eyes wide with fear. The workers murmured among themselves, shocked to see their mistress displayed in such a state. For years, she had stood above them, aloof and untouchable. Now she stood exposed, trembling, awaiting her husband's judgment. William stepped forward, his voice booming across the courtyard. "This woman," he declared, pointing at Eleanor, "has broken her vows. She has betrayed me. She has disgraced this house." His eyes scanned the crowd, daring anyone to look away, and for this crime she will be judged, not by me, no. Today, she will be judged by those she has mistreated, those who know her cruelty. Let the slaves decide her fate. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Eleanor's face drained of color. To be punished by those she had always looked down upon was worse than death itself. For William, this was not only punishment, it was revenge. He would restore his honor not with secrecy but with spectacle. Rage had consumed him entirely, transforming his humiliation into a performance of power. He believed he was teaching a lesson, not just to Eleanor, but to everyone who might ever dare to think him weak. Eleanor fell to her knees, her voice cracking. "William, please! Not like this! You can't!" But William did not even glance at her. His decision was final, his pride satisfied only by her public disgrace. The enslaved workers looked at one another stunned. They had suffered under both master and mistress, but never had they been given such authority. Slowly, realization dawned for once. Power had shifted, and so, beneath the scorching Alabama sun, Eleanor Hargrove's fate would no longer rest in her husband's hands. It would rest in the hands of those she had once considered beneath her. For William, it was a moment of triumph, born out of fury and humiliation. But for Eleanor, it was the beginning of her descent into a punishment that would haunt her forever. This 1,000-word expansion builds the intensity. William's pride turns suspicion into rage, rage into a public spectacle. Eleanor's betrayal is discovered, and William's decision sets the stage for the shocking twist, the enslaved workers being given power over her fate. The courtyard of Hargrove Plantation had never witnessed such a scene. Normally, it was a place of order and command, where William's voice dictated the rhythm of life, assigning labor, delivering punishments, and reinforcing his authority. But on this day, the balance shifted. Eleanor Hargrove stood trembling before the gathered enslaved men and women, her pale hands clutching her gown, as if fabric alone could shield her from shame. For years she had walked among them with her chin lifted high, her words sharp, her punishments often cruel. She had scolded mothers for singing too loudly in the fields, struck servants for the smallest mistakes, and reminded them constantly of their place. Now, for the first time, she had no power. William's voice thundered across the courtyard. "You have all suffered her cruelty," he said, his eyes blazing with fury. "You have felt her lash as much as mine. Today, you will be the ones to decide her fate." The enslaved workers exchanged bewildered glances. They had been conditioned for years to obey, to cower, to remain silent. Authority flowed one way, down from William and Eleanor, never up. To be given power, even for a moment, was so foreign it felt dangerous. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, her voice breaking.
"William, please, don't do this. Don't shame me like this."
Her words, once commanding, now sounded pitiful. But William did not look at her. He looked at the faces of his workers, faces lined with years of toil and quiet suffering. "You have been voiceless long enough. Now speak. What shall be done to her?" A heavy silence followed. The air was thick with heat and tension. Some of the enslaved shifted uncomfortably, uncertain if this was a trap. Could they truly pass judgment on their mistress without retribution later? Others stared at Eleanor, their eyes hard, remembering the sting of her cruelty. Finally, an older man named Josiah, who had worked the plantation longer than anyone, stepped forward. His back was bent from years of labor, but his voice carried steady strength. "Mistress Hargrove never showed mercy," he said slowly. "She whipped the children when they cried too long. She beat Clara for dropping a tray. She looked at us as if we were less than dogs." He turned his gaze to William. "You say her fate is ours to choose. Then let her feel what it means to be humbled." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. One by one, others began to speak. Stories of Eleanor's harshness, her sharp tongue, her cold heart. For years, they had held their anger in silence. Now, for the first time, their voices poured out like water breaking through a dam. Eleanor's face flushed red. She had expected punishment, yes, but not like this. To hear the people she had ruled over listing her sins, exposing her cruelty in front of her husband, was a humiliation deeper than any lash. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked desperately toward William, but he remained stone-faced. His pride demanded this spectacle. Josiah raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "We do not wish to kill her," he said firmly. "We are not murderers, but we will strip her pride the way she stripped ours." The decision was made. Eleanor was forced to stand before them, her head bowed, while the enslaved workers enacted a punishment both symbolic and devastating. They tore the fine ribbons from her gown, stripped the pearls from her neck, and tossed them into the dirt. She was made to kneel before those she had once commanded and beg forgiveness for every cruelty. "Say it," Josiah ordered. Eleanor's lips trembled. I am sorry," she whispered, louder. Another woman demanded. A woman Eleanor had once slapped for breaking a dish.
"I am sorry,"
Eleanor cried out, her voice breaking.
"Forgive me."
The enslaved made her repeat it again and again, until her pride shattered and her words became hoarse. They paraded her around the courtyard, stripped of dignity, while laughter and murmurs followed her steps. It was not violence that broke her, it was shame. For the enslaved, the moment was unforgettable. For once, the power that had crushed them for years shifted into their hands. Though they knew the sun would set and William's rule would return, they had tasted something rarer: justice. William watched with grim satisfaction. In his mind, this was the perfect punishment. Eleanor's humiliation was total, and his honor was restored, not by his hand, but by the very people she had despised. It was a spectacle no one would forget, ensuring that gossip in town would spread not of his weakness, but of his ruthless authority. Yet beneath the surface, something far greater had been set in motion. The enslaved now knew that power could change hands, even briefly. They had seen their mistress brought low, forced to bow before them. Though William believed he had orchestrated a lesson in loyalty, he had unknowingly planted a seed of defiance in the hearts of those who served him. When the punishment was over, Eleanor was left kneeling in the dirt, her dress torn, her pride in tatters. The enslaved slowly dispersed, returning to the fields, their faces a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and something deeper, a quiet realization that the world was not as unchangeable as they had believed. Eleanor was taken back into the house, but she was not the same woman who had stood there hours earlier. The haughty mistress, the cruel overseer of servants, had been stripped away. In her place was a broken woman, haunted by shame and bitterness. William, however, stood taller than ever. In his eyes, he had turned disgrace into dominance, betrayal into a spectacle of control. Yet he did not understand that the very act meant to preserve his pride had also revealed its fragility. His marriage was ruined, his wife was humiliated, and the people he enslaved had glimpsed what it meant to hold power over their oppressors. The tables had turned, if only for a day. But sometimes, a single day is enough to change everything. This expanded narrative shows how William, blinded by rage and pride, handed power to the enslaved as a form of punishment for his wife, never realizing that he was also showing them the possibility of resistance. Eleanor's humiliation became a lesson not only for her, but for everyone watching. Pride crumbles, power shifts, and justice comes in unexpected forms. The sun hung high in the Alabama sky, beating down on the Hargrove plantation like a relentless overseer. The courtyard shimmered with heat, the air heavy with tension. Word had spread quickly, by whispers among the enslaved, by servants who slipped messages into town, that something extraordinary was happening at Hargrove Estate. By the time William ordered Eleanor to be brought forward once more, the courtyard was filled not only with his workers, but also with neighbors, field overseers, and townsfolk drawn by curiosity. A scandal involving the wife of William Hargrove was too tempting to ignore. Farmers, merchants, even the pastor from the local church appeared, each one eager to see how the proud master of the plantation would handle betrayal within his own walls. Eleanor stumbled into the open space, her gown torn from the earlier humiliation, her eyes red from weeping. Her once perfect hair clung to her face in damp strands. She had never been seen in such a state, stripped of the elegance that had defined her place in society. The crowd fell silent as William stepped forward. His presence was commanding, his back straight, his voice firm. He raised a hand, and when he spoke, his words carried like thunder. "Neighbors, workers, and friends," he began, "you know me as a man of honor. For years I have built this estate with discipline and strength. But today, I stand before you dishonored not by enemies, but by betrayal within my own home." A murmur rippled through the gathered people. Eleanor bowed her head, unable to meet the stares of those who had once envied her place as mistress of the plantation. William's voice hardened. "This woman, my wife, has broken her vows. She has betrayed her husband, her family, and the sanctity of our home. Were it left to me alone, I would pass judgment swiftly, but I will not. Today, those who have borne the weight of her cruelty will speak. Today, her punishment will not come from me. It will come from the people she once ruled over." Gasps spread through the crowd. To allow enslaved workers to judge a white mistress was unthinkable, almost blasphemous in the eyes of Southern society. Yet William's fury demanded spectacle. To him, this was not an act of mercy but a demonstration of control, proof that he could bend even the rigid rules of their world to restore his honor. The enslaved, hesitant at first, stepped forward one by one. They recounted Eleanor's cruelty, how she had mocked them, beaten them, turned her back on their suffering. Each story was a stone laid upon her shoulders, each memory a public stripping of her dignity. The townsfolk listened in stunned silence. To hear such accusations openly, from the mouths of those society deemed voiceless, was shocking. Yet William allowed it, his face impassive, as if each word carved justice into stone. When the testimonies ended, William gave a nod, then let the punishment fit the crime. Josiah, the elder among the enslaved, stepped forward once again. His voice was calm but firm. "She must kneel before us and confess. She must speak the truth with her own lips." And so Eleanor was forced to kneel on the dirt before the workers and townsfolk alike. Her knees pressed into the hot earth, her fine gown now stained with dust and sweat. The woman who had once held herself above all others now trembled at their feet. "Say it," Josiah demanded. Her voice cracked. "I have sinned." Louder, the crowd urged. "I have sinned," Eleanor cried, her voice echoing across the courtyard. "Say what you did," another voice shouted. Tears streamed down her face. "I betrayed my husband," she sobbed. "I betrayed this house. I am guilty." Each confession tore at her pride, each word peeling away the mask she had worn for so long. The workers made her repeat it, louder and louder. until her voice broke and her body shook with sobs. Then came the final act of judgment. Eleanor was stripped of her symbols of status, her pearls, her rings, the brooch William had given her on their wedding day. Each piece was tossed into the dirt, trampled underfoot by those she had scorned. The crowd watched as the mistress of Hargrove Plantation was reduced to a figure of shame, her wealth and dignity shattered before their eyes. For the enslaved, it was more than punishment. It was justice, symbolic, fleeting, but powerful. For once, the tables had turned. They were no longer silent shadows in her household. They were her judges, her accusers, her executioners of dignity. The townsfolk whispered among themselves. Some were shocked, scandalized that William would allow such a spectacle. Others nodded in grim approval, seeing in his actions not weakness, but ruthless strength. He had taken betrayal and turned it into a theater of power, ensuring his honor remained untarnished. The pastor, pale and shaken, muttered about sin and repentance, but even he dared not challenge William's decision. The sight of Eleanor kneeling in the dirt, begging for forgiveness, was proof enough that no one, even a lady of standing, was beyond judgment. When the ordeal was over, Eleanor was left broken, her body trembling, her spirit crushed. She could not look anyone in the eye as William ordered her back into the house. The crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them a story they would retell for years. The day William Hargrove made his adulterous wife kneel before slaves and neighbors alike, her pride ground into dust. For the enslaved, it was a moment burned into memory. They knew the next day the lash would return, the chains would remain, and William's power would endure. But they had seen their oppressor humbled, if only briefly. That knowledge lingered like a spark in dry timber, a reminder that even the mighty could fall. For William, the judgment was a triumph. He believed he had restored his honor, silenced gossip, and reasserted control. Yet what he did not realize was that his act had also exposed the fragility of the very system he upheld. By giving voice to the voiceless, even for a day, he had cracked the illusion that power was absolute. And for Eleanor, the judgment was worse than death. Her place in society was destroyed, her pride shattered, her name forever stained. She would live the rest of her days haunted not only by her betrayal, but by the memory of kneeling in the dirt before those she had once commanded. The public judgment was complete, but its echoes would carry far beyond the courtyard, shaping the future of the Hargrove family, the enslaved who served them, and the whispered legends of Alabama in 1840. This chapter shows the symbolic reversal of power. Eleanor, once the proud mistress, forced into public shame by those she scorned. William, believing he restored his honor. The enslaved, realizing power could shift, and the townsfolk, witnessing a scandal they would never forget. The echoes of that day lingered long after the crowd had dispersed, and the courtyard of Hargrove Plantation returned to its ordinary silence. But it was not truly ordinary anymore. Something irreversible had happened. The memory of Eleanor's humiliation, witnessed by both the enslaved and the free, had etched itself into the soil, into the walls of the mansion, into the whispers of every town gathering. Eleanor herself was never the same. Once the jewel of William's estate, she withdrew into herself, refusing to appear in public for weeks. She no longer hosted dinners or stood proudly at her husband's side during Sunday services. Instead, she drifted like a shadow through the halls of the house, her face pale, her voice rarely heard. Her pride, once sharp enough to wound anyone beneath her, was shattered beyond repair. Even when she attempted to reclaim some sense of dignity, the memory of kneeling in the dirt before those she had scorned would rise like a ghost. The enslaved could not look at her without recalling her shame. Neighbors could not hear her name without remembering the scandal. She lived not only disgraced but imprisoned in the memory of her own downfall. William, however, told himself he had triumphed. In his mind, the public punishment had restored his honor. Gossip in town no longer questioned his strength, but marveled at his ruthlessness. Men at the tavern clapped him on the back, saying, "You showed them, Hargrove. No one will dare cross you now." But beneath the surface of his pride lay cracks he could not see. His reputation was indeed preserved, but at what cost? His household was ruined, his wife broken, and the enslaved, though still bound to him, had tasted something dangerous, the power to judge, to condemn, to make even their mistress bow. That memory stayed with them like a buried ember. They still labored in the fields, still bent under the weight of the overseer's whip, but their hearts carried the knowledge that authority was not as unshakable as it seemed. They had seen the mighty fall. They had spoken, and their voices had mattered. For the enslaved, that moment became a secret source of strength, whispered about under the stars when the fields were quiet. Do you remember the day Mistress knelt? William, blinded by his obsession with pride, failed to recognize what he had unleashed. He believed he had humiliated Eleanor into obedience and reminded the enslaved of their place. But in truth, he had shown everyone, his wife, his workers, his neighbors, that power can turn, and that those considered voiceless can one day hold judgment. The community, too, carried the lesson. In church pews and market stalls, people whispered the story. Some said William was a genius of discipline, a man who could even bend the rules of society to uphold his honor. Others whispered uneasily that he had crossed a dangerous line by letting enslaved people act as judges over a white mistress. If power could shift in that courtyard, who was to say it could not shift further? In the years that followed, Eleanor's life became a cautionary tale. Young wives were warned, do not betray your husband. Look at what happened to Mrs. Hargrove. Her name became synonymous with disgrace, not because of her adultery alone, but because of the manner of her punishment. She was a living reminder that betrayal carried consequences that could strip even the most privileged of their dignity. For William, pride carried him onward, but it also hollowed him. He gained a reputation as a man not to be crossed, but behind closed doors, his household was cold and lifeless. He had won his honor, but he had lost his wife, his peace, and perhaps even the loyalty of those who worked his land. Pride had preserved his image but poisoned his legacy. And for the enslaved, the memory of Eleanor's downfall lingered like a promise. They knew their suffering would not end that day nor the next. But they carried with them the lesson that justice, however small, could come even in the most unexpected ways. That memory became part of their strength, part of their quiet defiance, part of the hope that one day the tables might turn again. This time for good. The story of that day spread beyond the plantation, carried on by whispers, retold in taverns and households across Alabama. Some embellished it, some softened it, but the core remained. The proud mistress of Hargrove Plantation had been judged publicly by those she had despised. Her shame was her husband's weapon, her humiliation his revenge. But in making her bow, William had revealed a truth greater than himself, that power is not fixed, that pride leads to downfall, and that justice comes in forms no man can fully control. One betrayal destroys trust and legacy. Eleanor's affair did not just wound her marriage, it shattered her place in society. Her name, once honored, became a byword for disgrace. Betrayal is not only personal, it ripples outward, touching family, community, and reputation. 2. Pride blinds men to consequence. William thought himself victorious, but his decision exposed the weakness of his rule. In humiliating Eleanor, he planted seeds of defiance among the enslaved and unease among his peers. Pride preserved his image but weakened his foundation. 3. Power is never permanent. The enslaved, powerless in every legal sense, held judgment over their mistress, if only for an hour. That brief reversal of power showed them a truth that could never be forgotten. Authority is not unbreakable, and even the high can be brought low. 4. Justice often comes unexpectedly. Eleanor's cruelty returned to her in a way she could never have imagined, through the voices of those she oppressed. Justice does not always come through courts or laws. Sometimes it comes through the humbling of pride and the turning of tables. 5. Respect is the foundation of relationships. William demanded obedience, not love. Eleanor sought affection elsewhere and paid the price. Their story reveals that without mutual respect and loyalty, even the grandest marriage is a hollow shell waiting to collapse. Closing moral: the tale of William and Eleanor Hargrove in Alabama, 1840, is not merely about scandal. It is about the fragility of pride, the cost of betrayal, and the shifting nature of power. William thought he had won by humiliating his wife, but he unknowingly weakened the very order he lived to protect. Eleanor thought she had found freedom in forbidden love, but it led her to disgrace. And the enslaved, though still bound in chains, learned that even those who seem untouchable can fall. It is a reminder across time. Betrayal brings consequence, pride invites downfall, and justice, though slow, will find its way.